Hi everyone, my name is Anna. So I am here today to talk to you about the Road to Redux. So a bit about me just to get started. As Dave mentioned, I am a developer at Nudge.ai. It's not really, it's getting cut off, yeah. Is there any way to fix that?
Change the resolution to 4:3.
Now you're on Windows and Windows.
Maybe, hold on.
Do you know how to change the aspect, the actual size of the screen? There we go. Yeah, so
What did you say?
at 10. Is that your first display or the second?
Second. Yeah, there we go. Okay, there we go. So I am a developer at Nudge.ai. We are a software company. I am also the founder of Business as Usual, which is a women's networking group that is focused on aiding in career development. So we run all sorts of different panels and networking events in Toronto. So if you are interested in that, feel free to check us out at businessasusual.io. I am also a really big Notorious B.I.G. fan. So if anyone else is, let's talk after. You can follow me on Twitter. You can tweet me during this talk. You can tweet me questions. You can just say hi if you want. It's up to you. So one second. There we go. A little bit about what Nudge does. We're an AI-powered sales platform. So what that means basically is that we have a ton of data and we try to present that data in a consumable way to our users. We're taking your network, we're giving you insights, we're giving you all sorts of actions to take on those insights. It's really cool if you're in sales. It's also really cool if you're just in general a person who cares about managing your network. So why am I telling you this? Because understanding how much data we have is part of understanding the problem that I'm going to tell you that we had. So this is a roadmap of what I am going to take you through today. I'm going to talk about what we're trying to solve. I'm going to talk about why we decided to choose Redux to solve that problem. We're going to go over some Redux basics, action creators, reducers, root reducer. I'm going to talk about using React and Redux together. I'm going to show you a working example using data from our application. I'm going to recap all of that and then talk about next steps. So the problem. The problem is that we have a ton of data. Like I said, we have lots of data based on our users, and we're trying to show that to them in ways where they can interact with it, which means that our data is all over the place. And I'm going to assume that most of you are front-end developers, so also going to assume that you spend a lot of time, like me, debugging. And when there's so much data, that can sometimes be really tricky. So what does our data look like? Kind of looks like this. It's just things happening all over the place. I'm going to give you an example so you can see our homepage so you can kind of get an idea of the complexity that we're trying to manage with all of this data. Looks like this. So here's our homepage. We're just going to watch all of these different widgets for a second. As you can see, there's multiple places where a user is going to interact with what is happening on the homepage. And to give you an idea of how much data you're looking at, there's about 60 API calls happening from about 20 different endpoints. It's a lot of things firing all over the place. Right now we're using Backbone, so lots of things are listening. It's really difficult to figure out where a change is coming from. Solution? Well, we talked about a lot of different solutions, but eventually we ended up deciding to try Redux, and that is the journey that I am going to take you on with me today. So, Redux. What is Redux? Hands up who's used Redux. Okay, so some people have some familiarity with it, that's great. So, let's get started. Whenever I learn something new, this is what I say to myself, verbatim. But it's okay, because it means that there's only one place to go from here, and that's up. And I am giving this talk from the assumption that you don't know anything about Redux. So for those of you that are brand new, this is going to make sense. So Redux is a state container. It's basically one state to rule them all. And that makes things really great for a problem that we have in our app, because it means we can track things from you know exactly where things are coming from, basically. So this is why we want it. It's one store, it's one state, it's less bug inducing, and it enables every developer's dream, time travel debugging. This is something that we really wanted at our company. So again, the biggest draw, if you've used Redux DevTools, then you know the magic that is Redux DevTools, which I will get into a little bit later. But just know that that's one of the biggest reasons that we wanted it. If you think back to the homepage that I showed you, wouldn't it be great to be able to know exactly when things were happening and firing? And the DevTools gives us an audit of all of those actions that are being dispatched. This is what they look like. Don't worry if it's confusing. I'm going to get into it a little bit later. But on the left-hand side, you can see this nice little register of every action that is being fired, and then you see the corresponding state change, which is great. Okay, so the basics of Redux. We're going to start from the beginning. What is an action? The docs say an action is a payload of information that sends data from the application to your store. But basically what that means is that an action describes that something happened, but it doesn't specify how the state changed. It's just like, I did this thing. Looks like this. So every action has a type that is required. Everything else that you include in there is just data. So I'm giving you an example here of an action type called tweet ignored with an ID of 5. Up next, we have something called an action creator. And what is that? It's exactly what it sounds like. Creates an action. Looks like this. It's a function called ignore company tweet. And we see our action type that I just showed you. Looks familiar in this function. Great. So what's next? We have this action. How do we handle it? What we need is for something to understand or handle the action that we just fired. So enter reducers. And what's a reducer? Reducer is a pure function. It takes a previous state and returns the next state. If you're familiar with the reduce method in JavaScript, then you know that reduce takes two things and returns one thing. And that's what's happening in this situation too. It takes previous state and in the action, and it gives you next state. So it specifies how the app state changes based on the action type that was previously described. So the things that we don't do in reducers, this is the important stuff. We don't mutate its argument because we don't want to perform side effects in this function, and we don't call impure functions. So we don't make API calls, and we don't use things like math.random. Why? Because we don't want any surprises and we don't want any side effects. That gives us really, really predictable code, which means that it's testable. And why do we want testable code? Well, because if someone says there's a bug in your code, you can say, no, it's not. Though there's not, I tested it. It's also the key behind time travel debugging, which is, again, exactly why we wanted to implement Redux into our application. So back to reducers. So this is, don't worry about what's going on here. I'm going to dig into this a bit later, but just wanted to give you an idea of what a reducer looks like. You can see at the top that we are taking in state right here. We are entering a switch statement based on the action type, tweet ignored, and then we're doing a bunch of stuff in here that I'm going to talk about later, but just know that this is where we are returning next state. So important things. Again, we do not mutate the state, we create a copy. We return, and also we return previous state for any unknown action. So if I called this reducer, or if this reducer ran and the action type was tweet liked, then it would just return default state, which is current state. Nothing would happen. Okay, reducer composition. So this is a fundamental pattern of Redux. I know that Yuri is going to talk about it later, so I'm not going to talk about it too much, but just to give you an idea, basically what happens is that we have multiple reducers and they control little slices of the app. And so you have specific actions associated with specific pieces of data, and it makes up your store. And we combine them into our application with something called combine reducers, and it looks like this. So here we have two different reducers, and we're combining them in our combine reducer function, and I'm going to show you what that looks like in a working example and a little bit later, and it will start to make a little bit more sense. So just a recap of the data flow. When I first started using Redux, learning Redux, everyone would just tell me, oh, it's a paradigm, which is kind of a confusing word. It's a pattern. It's a way of doing things. And when you use Redux in your application, it basically gives you a process with which to write your code. And that's beneficial for a lot of reasons, but especially for debugging, because you know exactly that there's only one way that state is changing, and it's in this order. So again, just to recap what we talked about, we have an action type and an action creator. That gets dispatched. Reducer handles that, specifies the state change, and when the state changes, the UI changes. The only thing missing from this photo is that you'd have an API box over here, a server, and there'd be arrows that are pointing to the action and also back to the server. Good. Okay, so let's look at a working example. So this is kind of a hello world example of some of the key action types that we would be using on that homepage. These are common action types, and that's why I wanted to create something using our actual app's data. So we have over here, these are tweets that are being ignored, and that's something that would happen on our homepage. And then over here, this is just an update to the UI, or showing and hiding things, something you would probably typically use jQuery for, but of course, if we're using Redux and React, then we're not going to do that. So again, we have, in this instance, two different reducers. We have this tweet one with an action type of ignore, and then we have some showing and hiding with a different reducer, and I was combining those in that combine reducer function that I showed you earlier. Again, just a recap of what's happening. We have actions. The actions get handled by the reducers. The reducer specifies the state change. When the state changes, the UI changes. So that was the basics of Redux, and now we're going to talk about how to use Redux and React together. So React Redux gives us a few basic utility functions that makes it really easy for us to do, and it's really, really great. And so we're going to talk about provider, connect, bind action creators, map state to props, and map dispatch to props. So first one we're going to talk about is provider. And what does provider do? It basically just makes your store accessible as a prop to whatever you put inside of it. So it looks like this. This is going to look familiar if you're using React. You see here we have a provider, we have a store that we have specified, and then it's accessible to this component here called app. Connect. So Connect is another huge draw for us using Redux and React together. And what does it do? It makes all the props available to the specific component that we connect. And that's really beneficial when you're using React, because I'm sure you've run into the problem where you're just passing props down tons and tons of levels, and you have all sorts of components that don't need to know about specific data, and that kind of just pollutes your code. So with Connect, it means we can inject our data exactly into the component that we care about, which makes things nice and tidy and testable. So it looks like this. Don't worry about what's inside, because I'm going to talk about that. But what's important to know is we have Connect here, and then we have my React component, which is the component that I am injecting the data into. It looks like this in DevTools. I don't know if you can see that, but it says Connect right here. React DevTools are really great for letting us know what's happening. So we see that my React component is connected. And then over here we have the props that we have mapped. So let's get into that. So what are we connecting? We're providing two different things to our specific component. We're providing the state of the store, map state to props, and that's the state of the Redux store. And we're providing the actions, and the actions are the action creators, and essentially they're the things that depend on the dispatch function. They depend on being dispatched. We're mapping those to our component. So the first argument takes a Redux store state and it returns it as props so that we can access it in our component. Looks like this. So if you think back to that example that I showed you, there's two different parts of slices of state that I'm using. There's the company social store, which is the tweet data that you saw being ignored on this side. And then we have our helper action store, and that was just the showing and hiding. And I want to map the state of those things specifically to this component. I could have more, I could have less. It really depends on what I'm trying to do. Second argument. So the second argument is map dispatch to props. And it's basically mapping the things that need to be dispatched. The action creators need to be dispatched, and it makes those action creators accessible to us on the component that we care about. Looks like this. So here we have map dispatch to props. I'm going to talk about this in a second. But we have our show more creators, which are the show, blast and show more. And we have our company social creators, which is going to be the ignore tweet one. And we're mapping all of those actions. They're from different reducers, but we're mapping them into one component. Looks like this in DevTools. So you can see we have a bunch of different actions here, but the ones that I am going to dig into is ignore company tweet, show less, and show more. Okay, bind action creators. I don't know if you're familiar with using these, but essentially what it does is it wraps every action creator that we cared about in a dispatch function so that we can invoke it directly in our code and call it on and on click. Again, automagically, which is a word, by the way, I looked that up. It doesn't sound like a word, but it is one. Wraps everything in a dispatch function for us, which is really, really great. It looks like this because I was using bind action creators in the other example, so it looks the same. But the important thing to note is that what I was doing in this is there's an object of two separate kinds of action creators. So I have all of the actions I want available to me as props in this specific component that I have connected. So let's put it all together. Let's do a working example of showing and hiding. Again, just to recap the flow. I'm being really repetitive on this because I think that when it comes to Redux, if you really understand the core principles, then the advanced stuff and the complex stuff is really just different variations of the same core principles. So this is really the important stuff to understand. Again, we have action types. The action types get handled by our reducers. The reducer takes current state, takes the action type, returns to us a new object of next state. There are no mutations. And when that state is updated, the UI changes. So what do we want to change? Again, if we look back to that working example, we want to change a value of show from false to true or from true to false. We're clicking this button, we're changing this value, we're updating the Redux store. This looks familiar. This is just a div. That's really great. Look at our on click. This would look the same if it was the show less button, except it would say show less. Okay, so again, these are the action creators that we have associated with the show more store, the reducer. We have two different types here. We have show more, that's a type, and then we have show less with a type. So when one of those actions get dispatched because of our click, goes into our helper action store, takes a state. The state is going to go in here into our switch statement, and if it matches the case, then it's going to go into here, and we're going to return a new object to us, taking a copy, a shallow copy of current state, and then specifying the change that we wanted to make and giving us that next state. This is the juicy stuff right here. So again, just really important things to note. Because we want to specify a specific item without mutations, we clone the old object. What I was doing here is using something called spread operator. If you use ES6, then you know what's happening there. And yeah, we clone the old object, we specify the change we want to make, and then we return a new object with the change. So it's not an update. We're not taking old state and updating, it's a new state. There's no mutations. So let's look again. This is just to reiterate exactly what I just said. We are not mutating old state, we get next state with a reducer. Great. Let's look at the example again. We're clicking show less or show more. Those action creators that I showed you are being handled by our reducer. Our reducer specifies the change from show to false to true or true to false. Therefore, the UI updates. Now, what about those Redux dev tools that I was talking about? Let's look at what happens. So again, this is why we want Redux in our application. This is a scenario or an audit or a register of every single action that fired on that spike that I showed you. You can see everything. You can see the action types here. I was clicking show more, show less, show more, show less, show more. And then you see right here that our value in the state store is changing from false to true. And that's, again, really, really helpful for debugging, especially for a home page that is as chatty as ours. So recaps, let's just go over exactly what I just talked about. Why do we like Redux? Well, like I said, it's an audit of all the actions that are fired, and on a homepage that's really super busy, that's really, really helpful for us. It also optimizes the undo redo functionality, which again, it simplifies our workflow, it simplifies our debugging process, especially if we have a user that runs into a specific problem, we can plug in those action types and we can recreate the scenario and understand exactly what went wrong in our code. And it means we can time travel. I'm not done. I just really wanted to emphasize time travel debugging. So what's going on here? This is our dev team. We're time traveling together. That is me eating a Twinkie in time travel. Okay. Okay. Just to conclude, let's look at a homepage again, just so you can understand, again, like why does it matter that we have this audit of all of our actions? Because look how many actions could happen on this homepage. There's so many different ways for a user to interact, and Redux really simplifies our understanding of our code because we have a list of the scenario that happened, and it just really is fantastic for us. So again, implementing Redux was helpful for us because of the dependability that it created. It's really easy to know when something changes. It prevents some side effects. I can't say that it prevents all side effects, but it prevents most. And it's super, super testable, which is really great because it means that our code is predictable, and that is what we want. We want our functions to do exactly what we expect. So this is not a recap, but this is things to remember because this is what I found confusing when I was learning Redux. But this .setState is different than Redux store state. So React state, as I'm sure most of you know, it handles the redraw and the behavior of a specific component, and that is exclusive to the component itself. Whereas the Redux store state is a combination of reducers, like I was just talking about, and each of those reducers is responsible for managing a small slice of the app's logic. What I'm going to show you next is what the store looks like in Redux DevTools. I'm not going to go into this because again, Yuri is going to talk about how to construct your store. So I just wanted to give you an idea of what it looks like because it's really, really cool. I think this is really cool. If you like data visualization, you probably think it's really cool too. But if you look here, this is where our one state is happening. We have all these different reducers here. The ones that I showed you, company social store and helper action store, but these are combined with a bunch of different ones, and we can see our whole state tree in one nice place. And we can see, again, how the actions are happening and when the actions happen and how that affects the change of our store. So this is a Cole's Notes version of what I just said, because again, I thought this was confusing when I was learning. React state is exclusive to the component, and the Redux store state is app-wide. And one thing to realize is that not everything I would argue that not everything has to be stored in your Redux store state. You really only have to store the things that you care about. If you don't care about it, then you can just keep it in your component state. It's up to you. So just some next steps and explorations. Because of the way that our data is, the homepage that I showed you, a lot of it is relational. A lot of it depends on other parts of it. So the next thing that we would have to do in terms of rolling Redux into our app, because it is a live app and we do have users, and you can't just make all these changes willy-nilly and hope for the best. So we would have to do something, we would have to normalize our data. And what does normalize mean? It basically means you just pull it all apart so that nothing is nested. So that's something that we've begun to explore. And then we'd also have to use something called middleware, because you need middleware in order to do asynchronous calls with Redux. And obviously we are going to need to do asynchronous calls. So that's all I have for you today. Let's be friends. Tweet me if you like this talk, or if you have any questions, or if you just want to say hi. And if you wanted to ask a question now, then the floor is open.
Any questions? Don't be shy.
Yeah. Well, I think you would specify what they look like. So it would just be up to you.
We should repeat the question.
The question was, what do the keys look like if you are normalizing your data? Any other questions?
Any
Yeah.
other questions?
You mentioned that you can replay through a series of actions that happen to diagnose issues that users might have encountered.
Yeah.
Something that is integrated into your error reporting in the app itself, or is that something that you use more in the development environment?
We could do both. Right now it's something we use in development, but actually, it's a good idea probably to connect it with something called Splunk, which is logging, and then we can do the same thing when our users run into those errors, and we can replay exactly the scenario that they faced and see what happens if there's a bug that's happening between action 4 and action 5. I can really figure that out with the Redux DevTools and with the time traveling. So yeah, that's actually a good idea. I'm gonna do that. Anything else?
Looks like that's it. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Anna.